Galakrond's Fall is the first half of the new Mega Dungeon for Mythic Plus in Season 3. The dungeon will start with a 35-minute timer, so as long as you complete the dungeon within that window, you will upgrade your key. As you start the dungeon, you'll encounter 3 different types of mobs. Infinite Chrono Weavers will channel Chrono Melt. This must be interrupted as it deals heavy damage as well as reducing your haste and movement speed by 50%. Infinite Time Slicers will channel an uninterruptible tempo slice. Use hard CC like stuns or disorients to stop this. Healers must dispel the debuff if it applies. Epic Rippers will teleport to a random target with Time Rip and channel a Blade Storm. Players should move out of this area as soon as possible and stay loosely spread. The first boss you'll find is Chronikaar. She'll often cast Sand Stomp, forming withering sand pools under players that inflict heavy arcane damage and reduce players' haste by 25% and movement speed by 15%, so avoid standing in these. Chronikaar will target players and leap to their location one by one with Aeon Shatter, inflicting massive damage to players in the targeted area and firing out Aeon Fragments, dealing damage to players struck and knocking them back. This leap will also spawn an Aeon Residue inside the location that a player will have to soak, otherwise it will explode in a Residue Blast, dealing huge damage to all players and leaving a nasty dot on them. Tanks and healers will need to keep an eye out for Chrono Shear, knocking the tank away and causing a sheared timeline, increasing the target's damage taken by 600% for 1 minute. This debuff cannot be dispelled until the massive healing absorbed from the lifespan shear is healed through, so be prepared to save healing cooldowns for here. Rinse and repeat until you take out the boss. After defeating Chronikaar, you'll head out to the manifested Timeways area where you'll find a plethora of new mobs. Healers need to focus on dispelling Chrono Burst from the coalesced time mobs. This 6-second debuff applies to 2 random targets, dealing heavy arcane damage upon removal to players within 15 yards, and causing any phased out mobs that are hit to spawn an interval which also explodes upon death. Players should also make sure to interrupt the infinite bolt volley from these mobs to stop heavy party-wide damage. Temporal fusions will cast triple strike on the tank. Be prepared to use mitigation for these casts if you're in trouble. Coalesced moments will cast infinite bolt. Interrupt this where possible, but healers must watch out for the tainted sands debuff, dealing heavy damage to the afflicted player every 1 second for 9 seconds. Dispel this as quick as you can. Time Stream Leech's Innovate cast must be interrupted. If the cast is successful, it turns into an uninterruptible channel that must be CC'd. Time Stream Anomalies will cast Bloom. Dispel this ASAP or the debuff will be duplicated onto a nearby player so it can quickly get out of hand. Also, avoid being hit by the Untwist Frontal. Generally, this will target the tank, so the rest of your group should stay behind. Moving on to the second boss, we have the manifested Timeways. Around this boss are fields of decaying and accelerating time that continuously tick around the boss in segments. Decaying time inflicts arcane damage to players every 3 seconds and reduces players' damage taken by 20%. Accelerating time inflicts arcane damage every 1 second and increases movement speed by 30%. Needless to say, players should try and position themselves in the decaying time segments for the majority of the fight to reduce incoming damage. The boss will also apply Chrono Fader to 2 players that inflicts more arcane damage to them for 30 seconds and needs dispelling. Once dispelled, it will release a ripple of bronze magic, dealing huge damage to players passing through it, so you'll want to drop it in the accelerated time zone. Fragments of time will emit pockets of time which radiate outwards from the boss, inflicting damage upon impact and applying a dot for 6 seconds that can stack, so avoid these at all costs. These pockets are also affected by decaying and accelerating time. Tanks will want to watch out for the Timeways Unwind ability, inflicting arcane damage in a frontal cone twice. If the tank is afflicted with decaying time, the second tick is noticeably delayed, so tanks will want to position themselves in the darker triangles for this. As a tank, you'll also want to make sure you are always in melee range from the boss, otherwise it will start to cast Radiant, inflicting arcane damage that increases by 15% for each cast. Upon defeating the Timeways, you will encounter an Infinite Infiltrator. Avoid the timeless Cursed Ground animations and make sure to use a defensive on the Infinite Fury cast. This deals massive party-wide damage over 5 seconds, so prepare accordingly. Blight Chunks are the easiest mobs to deal with themselves, but upon death they buff nearby risen creatures with Relentless Hunger, increasing its melee attack damage by 50% for 10 seconds, so tanks need to commit big defensives here once the risen dragons are fully buffed. These risen dragons have a necrotic outburst aura, inflicting heavy party-wide damage every 2 seconds, so generally I'd recommend pulling one at a time unless you can commit some major cooldowns here. Outside of that, avoid the Blight Spew swirlies they fire out, it will likely kill you, but if not, you'll also receive a 1.5 second stun. The next boss you'll face is the Blight of Galakrond. This boss is a 3-stage encounter, starting with an ooze that seeps toxic corruption on the ground through Blight Seep. Occasionally, the Blight will afflict players with corrosion. Corrosion will inflict nature damage to the player for 15 seconds, and upon expiration, the player will become mind controlled. To remove this debuff, you'll want to pass it to your tank ready for Blight Reclamation. The Blight shoots out a frontal cone, inflicting big physical damage and pulls the tank in, also reclaiming the corrosion, removing the affliction from your tank. After taking enough damage, the Blight then transfers to a new host. Anzon becomes active and has access to all of the Blight's abilities, but will also cast Necrotic Winds, pulling players into the Blight Seep while sending out volleys of tornadoes. These knock players back and inflict nature damage if struck. The final phase spawns Lozkaleth and Dazak, which share a health pool via Essence connection. Again, they gain access to the previous abilities, but Loz will root a player with Necrofrost, reducing their haste by 20% until the ice is destroyed around them, so players will want to swap and burst this down. Dazak channels a frontal incinerating Blight Breath, so dodge this, but note that it also damages the Necrofrost. He also casts Blight Split, dealing damage to random players. Before moving on to the final boss, you'll find mobs we've previously encountered, but you'll also find Iridikron's creations. Make sure to interrupt their Stonebolt casts. Failing to do so inflicts a stacking bleed debuff that hits like a truck. Finally, we encounter Iridikron. The first thing to know with this fight is defeating Iridikron is not the goal of this fight. Instead, we must break his concentration so that our partner Chromie can attack. During the fight, Iridikron is trying to kill Chromie, so we must protect her as she protects us. The boss will target a player with Extinction Blast, one-shotting anyone within the impact zone unless you are under Chromie's timeline protection. This bubble reduces incoming damage to players by 97%, but will exhaust Chromie after the channel ends, increasing her damage taken by 1,500%. To overcome her exhaustion, players must protect her from Stonecracker Barrage. This attack follows the Extinction Blast and fires barrages of stones at Chromie for 2 seconds. This damage is split amongst Chromie and any players hit. Tanks will need to position themselves in the front swirly to prevent the rest of the group and Chromie from being afflicted with Stonecrack, dealing big damage every 1 second for 15 seconds, and this effect stacks. Tanks, make sure you run back into the zone after the first barrage pushes you back. Iridikron will shield himself with Earth Surge. While the shield holds, he pulses out AoE damage to your group. These waves also increase the damage of the next wave, and this stacks, so the aim of the game is to take out this shield ASAP. While channeling, he will also be sending out erupting pillars you'll need to dodge that deal large damage and knock players back if struck. After destroying the shield, Iridikron will slam his wings with pulverizing exhalation, dealing massive nature damage to anybody caught in the huge frontal or circle under him. At this time, his wing slam also causes pulverizing creations to spawn under players. These creations will spam cast Stonebolt, inflicting a bleed on players, so stack them up, CC them, and burst them down. During the fight, the boss overwhelms the tank with Crushing Onslaught, increasing the physical damage taken by the player by 75% for 3 seconds, and this stacks. Tanks will need to be wary of this debuff getting too high. Finally, at 100 confidence, Iridikron unleashes a Cataclysmic Obliteration. Here he will concentrate on finishing his cast to unleash a one-shot to the party, reducing his damage taken by 99%, but if players reduce his energy to 0 before the cast finishes, his energy backfires and staggers him. To help with this, Chromie casts Timeline Transcendence, allowing players to see their future potential. This increases our damage, haste, cooldown recovery, and resource regeneration massively so that we can stop Iridikron. But that's all you need to know for this fight, and that wraps up Galakrond's Fall in Mythic Plus. If this guide did help you or a friend out, then please feel free to drop a like down below and subscribe to your boy. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.